Great. Thanks for having us. It's always fun to get together. Ian, Cedric, and I are sort of the three mold principals. So to get us all with the opportunity to chat together is not only fun for us, but hopefully valuable for the audience. So I won't go through our backgrounds extensively. That's really being done. But please feel free to read through them when you get the slide pack at the end. But between the three of us, we see a lot of different kinds of mold in a lot of different settings. And what I'd like to do today, instead of having a straight sort of lecture style, is I'm going to be in control of the slides, but we're going to try to do it as a bit more of a discussion. I'd really like to have the opportunity for the three of us to share our experiences on site and on remediation projects that go well, that go poorly, and hopefully provide the audience with a bit of an opportunity to dig into the topics they find most interesting. We're going to try to brush over a lot of the concepts, and then if there's things that really interest people, we can go back and visit them a little bit more. There'll be a few case studies that hopefully sort of illustrate some of the points we're going to make, but the main themes are really going to be the health and legal ramifications. So the legislative underpinning, how it works and the lack of it in some areas, the start of projects, sort of the initial investigations and scoping, what goes right and what goes wrong, and what we know about remediation in terms of industry best practice and where things go off the rails a little bit, and then spend a bit of time on filtration, containment, infection prevention, how you stop dust and mold and spores and that kind of thing moving around. So I'll start with a little bit of a question. We get asked a lot who we are, what do we call ourselves? You know, what does it mean when we say that we're an IEP or an indoor environmental professional? So my first question to everyone is, do you know what an IEP is? Have you heard the term? Have you seen it applied? Have you used an IEP before, or is it not really something that you had a reason to engage with previously? There's a few different terms for what it is that we do, and certainly people that come from very varied backgrounds. So I'll give you all a moment to answer, and then we'll give a little bit of an insight into what we see, who is an IEP and what they do. So I'll move to the next slide so I can kind of preface what it is I'm going to be talking about next. You may know IEPs as a few different names. So some of you may be more familiar as you're voting with the concept of a hygienist. But there are also different flavors of occupational hygienists. If you're in a different part of the world, they're often called industrial hygienists. In Australia, you can have certified occupational hygienists. IEPs is another sort of name for that. They may well focus on particular aspects of indoor environmental quality. So I'm interested to see what people's exposure to this particular topic is. All right, can we have a look at the votes if everyone's had a chance?
Can you see the results there, Michael?
Is that just on the polls?
Yeah, just on the polls down the bottom. If you can't see it, you've only got 7% here saying that yes, of course. You've only 13% saying yes, but I've not needed to engage one before. 47% saying I think I know, but I'm a little sketchy on what they do, and 31% saying I don't know. That's
really interesting, because certainly from a technical perspective, it's really easy to forget that if you know your area really well, a lot of people may not, and that's really a good reason to have these seminars. So I'll kind of throw it open to Ian and Cedric here. Can you give me a really quick summary from your perspective? What is an IEP? What do they do? Where do they fit in terms of mold and buildings? I'll throw it to who wants to start.
I'll start first.
Go for it, Cedric.
Yeah, I'll start first. And again, some of the things that as I go through some of the definitions of what we consider an IEP, some things that we need to consider really are looking at experience and training. So if we go back to the origins of the IEP, it was originally coined by the IICRC, the Institute for Inspections, Cleaning and Restoration Certification, almost 20 years ago, in fact. And they defined an IEP as an individual who is qualified by knowledge, skill, education, training, certification, and experience to perform a variety of things. And that includes an assessment of the microbial ecology of structures, systems, and contents at the job site. So what we're looking at is someone, a professional that is able, through their experience and through their training, to go on site and to have a look at what are the mold impacts, what are the water damage impacts, what are the odor impacts. And based on their assessment using, instruments, they would then create a sampling strategy, go about sampling the indoor environment, whether it be airborne, surface mold, particulates, moisture measurements, and then gather all of that data, send it to the laboratory to get analyzed. And then when the results come back, look at that results, analyze that results, and from there, develop a scope of work. And that is, in essence, what an IEP does. And a little bit later on, I'm going to pass it over to Ian, who'll go through specifically what an IEP does. But one of the key things is, experience and qualifications. Where do they get those experience and qualifications? I mean, you can go through university, you can go through specific organizations that provide mold training or training related to the indoor environment. And all of that may take several years. So on-the-job work experience is also another key factor in terms of understanding what an IEP does. But I would like to also go on a slight tangent and say that you cannot be an expert in every scenario. And what is key is that your IEP or the IEP that you are developing a relationship with is a member of a wider multidisciplinary team. So again, we are blessed that we have each other in terms of the brain's trust that we can call on for very interesting things that come up. And as I go through a couple of examples a little bit later on, we'll see that when it comes to the job of an IEP or a mold job or an odor job, it may come in as, oh, I've got a problem. Can you come and help me? And that then really develops to something different. And as we go through our case studies a little bit later on, the thing that comes to mind is the ability to be curious, the ability to be open and to learn from other professionals. So I'll now hand over to Ian in terms of what are some tasks that we as IEP do.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Cedric. Yeah, so us as IEPs in the mould remediation process really undertake three main tasks. And basically, as Cedric mentioned earlier, we initially undertake some investigations to determine the nature and extent of the microbial contamination in order to develop an independent scope of remedial works. That's probably the primarily the main task we perform, but also we also can undertake interim assessments during the remediation process in order to provide ongoing advice into the refinement of the scope of works that we provided in the initial stage due to site or project complexities. And then I guess the final aspect of what we do in a mould remediation project is provide an independent post-remediation verification, or PRV, of the remediation work undertaken. So I guess we're engaged to provide guidance and undertake assessments because we're industry recognised experts in the field of this microbiological assessment and post-remediation verification. And we provide basically unbiased scientific independent advice in initial assessment and throughout the remediation process. We greatly assist with protecting health and well-being of occupants and the working contractors. And we want to mitigate lost time, money, reputation. And we want to prevent litigation and also reduce remedial costs, settlement amounts in insurance claims.
And I think just just to round things up, I think that's really important to understand the potential impacts. Looking at the flip side of things, what happens if you don't engage in IEP, particularly for those really complex jobs where just the delay in a week or two can cause significant structural damage, can cause degradation of infrastructure, contents can be lost, belongings can be lost, and some of this could be sentimental as well. And so we're talking about potentially mental health issues. And when we're looking at some of the secondary impacts, such as odors, such as complaints from tenants, from building occupants, all of that has secondary and tertiary impacts, which, when you look at the beginning, what could we have done versus, we are in this particular situation right now, help, that's often what we come up with.
Yeah, it's an interesting, like you say, Cedric, you can't be an expert in everything, but certainly we cross a lot of different areas. I mean, we do a lot of mold stuff, but certainly we do indoor air quality that sometimes leads into things like clandestine drug lab investigations. It's a lot of different elements that tie what an IEP does together. And a lot of the concepts that we might discuss today, although they're building related, they cross a couple of boundaries. So I'll move on to the first sort of area of discussion, the first sort of series of concepts that I'd like to outline. In contrast to, say, asbestos, mold is sort of a complicated risk. It doesn't have the same kind of regulations. The legislation hasn't really caught up to what we understand about the problem. And so from a nuts and bolts perspective, there's no acceptable level of mold in a building. There's no set point above which a bit of policy kicks in and says, well, now that's dangerous or now it's not. Outside of a few quite specific areas like clean rooms and food prep areas and clinical settings and that kind of thing. In a building, whether it's domestic or commercial, there's a bit less hard and fast guidance, which makes it sort of a difficult thing to tackle sometimes, often confounded by the fact that you've also got mold present in the environment naturally, just in the air, depending on the season and the surrounding land use and that kind of thing. And so one of the key things that we will often, from a legal perspective, it's not infrequent that we'll be called in because someone else has done an investigation and they've made recommendations, and maybe that's gone well or maybe it hasn't, and then we've been called in to sort of start filling in the gaps or pick up pieces after something goes wrong or something like that. And we may be asked to review previous reports. And one of the things that we see from time to time is a lack of references, nothing to compare against, whether that's an external sample or somewhere non-impacted in a building. When you're doing this kind of investigation, it's critically important to make sure that you have those reference points that you can compare your problem and non-problem areas against. That's just sort of one of the key things that underpins any sampling event, whether it's chemical or biological. Another complication, particularly relating to mold, is that the health effects are not necessarily dose dependent. They're not necessarily a factor of, once again, over this point, we know that X effect will occur. It doesn't really work like that. It's also key to understand who's present, whether they have any pre-existing underlying health conditions. If it's a hospital setting, you've got sensitive individuals present. They may well already be unwell. And so the importance around making sure you have all of the underpinning of what you do correct becomes even more critical. Documentation is really important. It sounds very dry, but documenting what you do and why is a hugely important bit of work. In terms of remediation, really good remediators will keep records of actions taken, when they did them, what they removed, drying records of materials, what it started out as, how long it's been drying for, what level it's dried to now. Those kinds of records can be hugely valuable, particularly if we're asked maybe to review an ongoing bit of work. How well is this remediation project going? Does anything else need to go on? If those records are being kept, then we can sort of track the progress of the remediation and say, look, this is really about what you can expect. There's really nothing more that can be done, or something additional can be added. That documentation is really key to making sure that if this does ever end up in court, if it's legally challenged, that you've got your justifications and your records along the way to say, well, this is what I did and when, this is why I did it. And you've kind of got that backing to explain the steps that you've taken. It's also really important, and we'll pick up on this as we go along, the importance of not just the initial investigation, but looking at the midway point, what's been pulled out and why, how does it look, does more need to be done, but then the verification at the end. Has everything been cleaned? Has all the stuff that needs to be removed been done in the appropriate way? All that sort of stuff legally will add into, essentially, if it's ever audited, if it goes to court, that all that documentation essentially supports the work you've done. One we get asked a lot about, and I'm sure there might be further questions on it. From a microbial perspective, we're often asked, was that pre-event? The insurance company has said, we'll cover this bit of mold, but not that bit of mold, because this one relates to the leak in the laundry and that one was something else. We're not touching that. We're often asked to determine what is pre-event, what was pre-existing, that kind of thing. That's a complicated question, and that often depends on what you see on site. It's often very difficult to tease those things apart, but certainly from a microbial perspective, there are some things that we can rely on. The types of molds present, the amount of moisture in the material can give us some insight into how long a material has been wet for. That might be different between areas. It's not going to be the focus of this talk, but if there's questions about that, we can certainly dig into it. I'll give a real quick case study on an interesting piece of legal work we did that related to a heritage listed building. It was 1880s, I believe, cedar shingled roof that caught fire. And then the roof was never reinstated. And so we were called in to determine whether the building could be remediated. It was heritage listed. It wasn't a question of was it cost effective or what processes specifically had to be applied, but could it be done based upon our assessment of the building? Could it be put back together given the heritage of the building? And it was in a fairly poor condition. Not only had the fire damaged a lot of the internal components, decorative and structural, but the lack of a roof had meant that a lot of mold growth had occurred during that time. This is just some gory photos from inside, but Ian and I spent a lot of time very carefully documenting everything that we saw, particularly relating to the structure, how the roof looked, how it had been contained from the elements, what kind of moisture was present, where it was present. It actually started to rain during our assessment, and we took note of where the water was trickling through, where it was running, what the rain was doing, how the humidity and moisture conditions within the building changed. And because we'd kept that degree of documentation, it ended up going through several court proceedings. And we were asked, based upon our assessment, was the building able to be remediated, was part one. Part two was, had the damage occurred due to the original putting the fire out, the fire service coming, or was it due to ongoing neglect, damage to the roof structure, all that kind of thing. But because we'd sort of thoroughly documented everything, we had additional information on site. We could start to tease those things apart, which ended up becoming sort of central to the second part of the court proceedings. So this stuff sometimes does end up becoming not only really complicated, but very heavily legally scrutinized. So it's really worth the effort keeping those records and making sure you document everything well. So that's sort of the legal underpinning. If we start at the beginning of the process, I'm really interested to talk about the initial investigation and scoping. What can go wrong? What can go right? Certainly, waiting to engage us too long or starting the process after too much time has passed is always a problem. As Cedric mentioned, there's a critical window in which if you don't start the works, then your problem changes from purely moisture to now mold. And then if that goes on, it can become structural and health related. So getting us involved too late can be a problem. If you've already done some work, you've pulled the walls off, you've put them back on again, and we can't see what's going on underneath, it's really difficult for us to then say, yes, you've done a good job, because we've not actually seen anything. So you can get us involved too late in the remediation project as well. The initial scoping can also not look right. If you've started a remediation project and you think you know where you're headed with it, but you've not looked outside of the area you anticipated, it can start to look a little bit funny. So I'll throw this out to the group. I mean, Cedric, you've been called into lots of different remediation projects, not just at the beginning, but partway through or right at the end. What does that change in regards to what you can actually do, what you can now attend to on site if the project has already proceeded? And are there any warning signs or red flags or anything like that that let you know, that gives you an intuition as to whether a project is going to succeed or fail? Like, have they done or not done certain things? I'll throw it over to you.
Yep. It's a great question, and several cases really come to my mind in relation to some of the projects that I've done, particularly for schools and insurance jobs, and particularly when there is a delay in starting the remediation, as you mentioned, and a lot of the times it's due to several factors. Number one, budgets. Insurances approving for an assessor to get on site, or insurance approving for the wet materials to be removed. So that's one really big factor in terms of getting in there quick to deal with the water damage issue before it becomes a mold damage issue. Because when it comes to a water damage issue, again, as you mentioned, it can be a couple $100 to remove those wet materials and start that drying process before mold starts to grow. And when mold starts to grow, we're looking at remediation of wonderful pictures that we're seeing right now. Here's an example here of what happened in a particular school that I dealt with, where there was excessive rains and there was water ingress into the music room. Again, this, because it was something that happened during the school holidays, and it wasn't picked up until staff came into the school, we already have a delay in remediation action. So we say a week delay here, and this is a week when I'm coming in, and if you look at that, to the picture on the left, lovely bongos there. No, that's not vibration. That's wonderful fungal hyphae there growing out of those musical instruments. But what we were really also interested in when we come to situations like this, where you have a music teacher that's in tears saying, can I salvage my contents? And when you look at the potential damage, again, you can see on the right the woolen xylophone glockenspiel that has more spores and more hyphae starting to grow on the surface. Again, things that we need to consider are moisture damage, because for some of these instruments, they are sensitive to moisture, and so quick action is very important. So in this particular case study, we arrived on site and began itemizing the scope of works. Again, this is what an IEP does, itemizing the potential extent of contamination that has occurred throughout the various contents, and determining, can these musical instruments be saved, particularly those that are sensitive to moisture. And so we went about looking at these contents and musical instruments, and by the end of the day, we're able to develop a preliminary scope of works. And this is very important as well, that you engage an IEP that has the experience and that has the knowledge to be able to develop scope of works that you can action quickly, rather than waiting 2 weeks for a report that tells you what to do. So having that relationship with the IEP is important to get that quick action. Okay, so we developed a preliminary scope of works by the end of the day, with the focus on trying to salvage some of the more wooden musical instruments that were sensitive to water damage. Unfortunately, it took another further week before any actions could happen, and now we're looking at a 2 to 3 week time frame where water is now seeping into some of these water damage building materials, and now impacting the wooden instruments. And so unfortunately, mold started to proliferate and grow basically on every single item in that musical room. And so we were unable to salvage many of the instruments because, again, not only was it because it was mold damage, but because of the water impacting on the wood itself, which again has the impact on the musical instruments. And you might think, oh, it's just contents, it can be replaced. But there's another aspect to secondary and tertiary damage, and that is the loss of musical instruments or contents, right, has resulted in the entire school music program being impacted because these key instruments were unable to be remediated. And with our current situation with COVID and getting supplies in, shipping, restocking of items, that meant even further impacts to the music program for the following term. So this has not only immediate impacts, but long-term impacts in terms of education for this particular case study. And so there's several key actions that I want to point out here. And the first is, if you're an organization that is managing properties, do you have some sort of a disaster management plan? We've got particular packages here in Greencap looking at mold management plans. And it's about what you as an organization can do in terms of immediate actions. Are they documented? What should we undertake to try and minimize our losses? Do you have access to a panel of assessors, builders, remediators, trades that are trained to do the appropriate things? And later on, when Ian is talking about stuff, you know, untrained people that go in sometimes create even more damage when it comes to mold growth. Okay, so again, this particular first case study it's one where we need to understand that quick action is very important.
Mm.
Yeah. My second case study again goes back to what I talked about an IAP being curious and being able to be multidisciplinary. So for this particular example, again at the school, we were called out because the school was saying, now we've got intermittent odors, okay, and occupants of the classroom were reporting intense and at times overpowering odors within the classroom. So the school did all sorts of things to try to manage the odor from those little bags of odor deodorizers. Now that didn't work. So they thought, okay, let's call in the plumbers, the heavy duty trades to come in. So several trades were engaged, and over several months looked at things like the sewer, capping of pipes, as you can see on the left side of, because they thought it was a sewer problem, because it kind of smelled like a sewer issue. They also did things like extending the vent over the roof line so that none of that odors come seeping back into the classroom. And they investigated some of the sewer pipes for any leakage and broken, but again, none of that seemed to do anything because the odor was still intermittently coming back. So the next train of thought was, how about rats? How about pests? Again, so they engaged pest controllers, but no pests were found. So Greencap was called. So and this was an interesting case because it went over 2 to 3 months. My first 2 visits, I did not detect any odors, and I was kind of thinking, it's just like a spirit or something. Every time I come, it goes away, and it was really, really weird. But on the 3rd visit, when it was a really, really cold morning that I arrived at the school, and I could smell the really pungent odor. So as soon as I smelled that odor, I knew what it was already. Okay, but again, being open, being curious. So I had to look around the external of the building and noticed on the fascia of the building, there were a lot of condensation and drips happening. So to me, it's like, condensation happening here. So what's going on in terms of the building envelope? Okay, so I then began to be a bit more curious and look into the ceiling structure and the ceiling space. And what I encountered was firstly a really strong pungent odor, and quickly identified that the odor was coming from wet insulation. Okay, so wet insulation from the existing, what we call here in Australia, anti-con, so anti-condensation or sarking on the metal roof. Okay, so okay, yay, we've discovered the issue. The issue is, wet insulation. This is the odor. That's it. Case closed. That's all that we need to deal with. But again, as we talked about earlier, in terms of the scope being a little bit bigger, as you start to investigate a little bit more, you can see on the picture on the right of the insulation, but we're beginning to see condensation and now mold growth. So visible mold growing. And so as you become more curious and look at, what is the extent of this condensation happening? And it appeared that there has been a failure in that sarking or the anti-con in preventing condensation. And again, as I mentioned before, we are unable to be experts in everything. Okay, so in this particular case, it appears that anti-con or that sarking was not doing what it was supposed to do and preventing condensation. So now not only is the insulation getting wet, causing a pungent odor, but now we have widespread mold growth on the underside of the metal roof throughout the classroom. And so here is where we need to be able to go to our brain's trust, go to standards, go to procedures that we currently have. And for this particular case, the AS/NZS 4200.2, which is the standard for pliable building membranes and underlays, a key resource in terms of have they installed the insulation and sarking appropriately? Have they in fact chosen the right type of insulation? Again, all of this as an IEP, research and learning and being open. And so these are basically two examples, Michael, that come to my mind in terms of when we're talking about delay in remediation actions, and when that initial scope was incorrect and the impact area was a little bit wider than expected. That's
fantastic. Thank you for those, Cedric. I mean, and another thing that we see a lot at the outset of a remediation project, I think that often limits the project such that it's going to be very difficult to achieve what's required, is there being too many limitations on what we can do on site, whether that's a limitation on the specific area. The client might say, we only want you to look in this particular room, or not in the roof space, or we only want you to look at surfaces but not the air, or we don't want you to look at the moisture. Those kinds of things are always red flags. That's often an indicator that it's going to be extremely challenging to scope it correctly or give them what they want. Related to that, a thing we see all the time that will often make a remediation much slower, much more expensive, require multiple attendances, that kind of thing, will simply be access. There's many times that we turn up and we'll say, oh, we need to get into the basement, and someone will say, oh, actually, we don't have the key for that, can't unlock the door. Sorry, you can't actually look at the basement, even though that's where the problem is. Can you do something else? We see that all the time. Holes not being able to be cut or drilled, so we can't look in a wall cavity or can't look in something like that, because they say, oh no, we'd prefer you not. Just look around and tell us what you can tell us. It makes it very difficult. Not being able to access a roof or a subfloor, whether that's because there's no access, or things like we weren't told that we need to bring a particularly tall platform ladder. They've got, 4-meter ceilings or something. Oh, we should have told you that, but we didn't. So we ask a lot of questions at the outset about where we're going to be looking. Do you have keys? Is the maintenance person going to be there? Making sure we've got trades present if need be, making sure we've got locksmiths, that kind of thing, so that we don't get stuck. So, I mean, Ian, you've gone to a lot of different projects. What do you come up against often when you're being asked, do this or don't do that? And what kind of problems do you see happen here?
I guess all those items you listed up in this slide here, Michael, really restrict on what us as IEPs can or cannot say in our reports, or what we can or not, or can include or cannot include in our scope of remedial works we develop for these remediation projects. So, I guess if we can't get into adjoining areas to delineate the impacts, then we can't assure that our recommendations are complete. As water and moisture and subsequent mold growth do not recognise these boundaries, such as like tenancy boundaries. Prior to remedial work starting, if we can't access subfloors and the like wall cavities to inspect conditions within these impacted areas, then we have to write requirements for an independent intrusive investigation to be undertaken during the initial stages of the remediation project in order to fully assess the delineate impacts. And obviously, that will increase, I guess, our costs and obviously the owner's costs or the insurance company's costs. We often get, well, can you not sample this? Can you not sample in here? We don't want to know here, etc. The conditions here. So if we can't sample to confirm conditions, we can't provide a full assessment on these conditions. So we have limitations in the guidance we can provide. For example, if we don't take any air samples, we can't assess if the mould is impacting on the airspace in the areas close to the source of the mould and even in adjoining areas. So we can't offer any guidance on whether or not we need to restrict access to the mould, obviously the impact area, or even in adjoining areas. If we can't collect surface samples, we can't accurately delineate surface impacts. And I guess anyone who can't collect moisture measurements, we're often told that. How do we know how far the moisture has gone and how where it's potentially traveled to and into what building materials?
Yeah.
These all ultimately mean that we have to re-attend site during the remediation project in order to fully assess conditions, and then the impacts in order to provide additional advice. Occasionally, we even get asked to perform independent PRVs, which are post-remediation verification assessments after all reinstatement works have been completed. However, we're unable to verify whether the materials within cavities or voids have been cleaned or dried adequately. Therefore, we cannot confirm the adequacy of the works being undertaken, but only assess conditions within the habitable areas. It's always our preference to perform all PRVs soon after remedial works have been completed, and that's before reinstatement works have commenced. Basically, in the PRV, we should provide a statement confirming that reinstatement works can start if conditions are acceptable and have been returned back to normal levels.
Yeah, it really puts some terrible brakes on the process. There's really very difficult to progress things when we can't even really say how big of a problem it is. Another thing that we get asked a lot, and we certainly see very varied approaches to, and this is a very content-rich bit. So if there's questions for it, please come back to this one. But in terms of remediation processes, what works and what doesn't, we get asked this all the time. We see very varied approaches because remediation, at least in Australia, anyone can call themselves a mould remediator. Really, there's no regulations saying you can and you can't. There are accreditations, there's training, there's certification. There are things that exist that can sort of highlight to you how well qualified or the experience of a remediator. Cedric referred to previously the IICRC. They have a range of different guides and standards for not just mold remediation, water, they do fire, they do a range of different stuff. And so the documents that we refer to a lot are the IICRC S500 and S520. They're the standard and reference guides for professional water damage restoration and professional mold damage restoration. They outline a formalized structure of how you approach these things based upon the industry's experience, expert opinions, that kind of thing. They're very well referenced and researched documents. So we can come back to that if there's more questions, but certainly in terms of key failure points, the things that we see a lot of is immediately a failure in drying, in actually source rectification. And the number of times we'll say, oh, we wipe the mold off, but it keeps coming back. We wipe the mold and it keeps coming back again and again. But if you ask, have you fixed whatever the problem is? They may often say, the client might say, we don't actually know what the problem is. Or we think it's a problem with the roof, but we've never looked. Or it's probably the old plumbing, but we've never had it fixed. You'll never attend to the problem if you don't deal with the source, which is always going to be moisture, which often ends up in not knowing when to dry. Remediation projects can go well off the rails if you let it get wet, it gets moldy, months go by, you pull off the wall linings, it's terribly moldy, you decide then you're going to blast hot air all over it and you spray spores everywhere. Knowing when to dry is really key, as well as knowing how to contain your work area, what goes into making sure the problem doesn't spread everywhere. Now, there is a range of different processes. I mean, I will ask a really brief question to the group, but we can come back to it in more detail. We often make joke about spray, pray, and walk away. There's a lot of people that just, you know, spray chemicals around and say they've remediated the mold. But there's a lot of different techniques, and certainly there's a spectrum from removal of the material through to what we call abrasive clean. There is a detailed clean, there's chemical treatment, there's encapsulation. Just as a really brief throw out to the group, I'm sure we'll all have a similar consensus on this. What is the relative effectiveness of, say, chemical treatment and encapsulation versus removal and abrasive cleaning? Who wants to start with that one?
I'll have a crack. But I'm always say to the clients, be very concerned if your remediation contractor suggests to spray chemicals to kill the mold. Like you said, internationally renowned remediation guidance document S520, which is the standard for professional mold remediation, states that to successfully remediate mold impacts, you need to remove the mold, not try and kill it. I guess the way in which mold removal is done is based on the porosity of the building material impacted, if it's non-porous, semi-porous, or porous, and also the level of mold impact, is it several spores or actual mold growth. Simply spraying a chemical mold growth is a recipe for disaster, as many marketed mold killing chemicals are water-based and contain active agents which bleach the mold. So what you're doing here is giving the mold extra moisture, aggravating it, in which is likely to increase sporulation, and then turning the structures to a lighter colour so it's less visible to the naked eye. The mould would undoubtedly be coming back, even with potentially, I guess it can spread more to joining materials or areas due to increased sporulation, especially if drying has been inadequate.
Yeah, absolutely. I might jump us ahead because I can see where we'll run short on time otherwise. But I'll keep going through because I know that there's a few other things, few key concepts I'd like to hit, if that's all right, guys.
Sure.
There are a range of documents out there. Please ask us if you'd like for more information on any of them, but there are a few good, not only international, but Australian-based bits of information. One of the real key things that we see go wrong, but sometimes go right, is containment and filtration. What does it mean when we talk about containing a remediation area? Certainly putting in filters is one thing we see a bit, but actually containing the area, making sure that spores, dust, etc., doesn't move, becomes increasingly more important when you're working in aged care facilities, maybe high-risk areas where you know there are people that are unwell. So I really want to talk a bit more about cross-contamination of unimpacted areas, what you do to contain things like ductwork and that kind of thing. So it's a really critical area, and I might throw it to Ian again to talk a bit about containment. I know you've got some case studies.
I've got a few
so I'll skip to the next slide and I'll let you talk a bit about containment.
Yeah, look, Michael, in my experience, containment is one of the most important aspects of any mold remediation program. If containment is not done right, you'll have issues down the track and project costs will increase significantly. Yeah, definitely. As mentioned above, appropriate containment was critical in all high-risk areas, which is not only health-related scenarios, but like healthcare and aged care facilities, but also protection of priceless artifacts. My first example here is an aged care community centre containing swimming pool, hydrotherapy pool. So here, this is where the mold growth was a result of poor ongoing ventilation. Basically, from the day dot built, this property was doomed, or this swimming pool was pretty much doomed. It's been, I think it was about 12 years old, but they had mold pretty much within the first 2 years, but nothing was ever done. So basically this poor ventilation led to severe condensation issues, which in turn caused substantial mold growth within the pool area adjoining gymnasium toilets. So you can see the mold there present on the diffusers on the air conditioning system above the pool, and also on the cold surfaces within adjoining. But that's one of the toilet facilities there. So yeah, basically that area got closed down to a certain degree, and we got the call. We did the initial investigation. And basically prepared a scope of remedial works. As it's obviously a aged care facility, containment was the most critical aspect of the project. In order to prevent airborne mold, spores and dust generated during the remedial works have an impact on the adjoining areas of this centre, which contains staff and susceptible residents, because obviously they still wanted to use other aspects of the community centre. For this job, containment was really pretty simple. All the contractor had to do was seal up some doorways in between the mould impacted areas and the remainder of the community centre. However, we needed to confirm that this simple containment was adequate, and so we performed a smoke test. So you can see in that right-hand slide picture there, that's the contractor using a smoke machine. I was on the other side of the door during this process, and basically on the phone to him, highlighting the areas where basically the smoke was coming through the containment, and another guy was there basically sticking more tape onto those areas. So we knew that that was a good containment. Nothing could get out of that. Probably a point to remember is also when you perform smoke tests like this, make sure to isolate the smoke detectors to prevent the fire alarm. Didn't happen in this case, but I was aware of it and obviously isolated those before going forward. So also, next slide, in this project, we had to protect the pool water from basically the debris being generated during the removal work. So you can see along the base of that, above that window, the lower window there, there's obviously a lot of removal works going on with the plasterboard. So we didn't want any of that plasterboard going into the wall. So we basically, the contractor built a structural hoarding to prevent not only debris falling into water, but also the workers. Project was a success. PRV clearance was given soon after. All of the molding materials removed and all cleaned successfully. So that's a good example of where simple containment worked. Nothing got through. The centre was able to basically run as normal. Obviously, the swimming pool was out of action and the gymnasium, but yeah, that was a good job. Next one is a larger project, quite intense. A lot of interested parties. Again, high risk, but not for health-related scenarios, but for protection of priceless artifacts. So the second example is a large government facility containing historical plant artifacts and records plus an adjoining DNA laboratory tenancy. So what happened here, significant leak occurred on a weekend whilst the facility was not occupied by staff. The leak occurred within the DNA lab, located in the proximate centre of the building. Ironically, the leak was from a sink in the laboratory that was never used, from a flexible pipe, which is obviously, you guys would know, was quite a common event in these kind of things, flexible hoses. The resulting flood impacted not only the areas of the DNA lab, but also the adjoining landlord-controlled areas containing historical plant records and seeds and artifacts. So you can see there is, the second photo there is hundreds of these shelves containing basically historical references to lots of stuff, lots of plant seeds, examples. Some of the specimen artifacts were from Matthew Flinders' explorations of Australia in the late 1700s. So these items were literally priceless. So containment was really critical in this project, really critical, and probably one of the most critical aspects of the project. We do want, obviously, cross-contamination occurring not only from a health point of view, but also from impacting on these precious artifacts. So with the construction contractor involved the installation of temporary containment walls. You can see in both those pictures there, plus entry and exit chambers, which is visible in the second photo, into the remediation areas in order that negative air containment could be maintained during the entire project. Again, we go to the next slide. Smoke tests in each of these separate areas were performed to confirm containment was adequate in preventing cross-contamination between these areas and areas outside the remediation zones. As you can see from the far right photo, sometimes you have to use a lot of tape to seal off cable trays and conduits running between areas. Another good point to note is in these larger smoke testing practices is good practice to notify the local fire authority of when smoke tests are being performed. As when the smoke is vented out to the outside after completion of tests, they're aware not to respond if they get phone calls from the public with smoke coming from the building. Again, another fairly simple project apart from the containment, bit of impact, but again, successful project. PRV clearance was given soon after all the moulder materials were removed and all remaining materials were cleaned successfully.
Yeah. I would like to get to questions, but you do have a good domestic example.
Yeah, I'll give one. I've got two, but I'll give one. So I'll
right.
quickly go to the first one.
Yeah.
So there's an example of when cross-contamination has occurred due to zero or poor containment installed. This example here is where the initial building remediation contract engaged by the insurance company undertook drying works to a water-damaged wall in the children's bedroom, adjacent ongoing leak within the adjoining laundry room. How the contract did not install any containment or remove any of the mouldy contents present within the bedroom. They set up forced drying equipment. However, no containment was installed to the bedroom doorway or no HEPA air filtration was set up. Unfortunately, as a result of these actions, the owners and their children were, after a few weeks of this equipment running, started to feel sick with respiratory issues. Both of the occupiers or owners of the building were local GPs who, after research into mould and associated health conditions, plus how to and how not to successfully remediate mould, requested they were relocated for the duration of the project after the whole house and contents were to be cleaned. So, and they had quite a few contents in that second slide. The insurance company had to entertain their request due to potential legal action as a result of the inadequate actions of the initial building remediation contractor, who did not simply contain the bedroom prior to setting up their equipment, which ultimately spread spores throughout the house, which also impacted, well, obviously other building materials within the building and also contents throughout the building. I guess if the contaminant had been installed to the bedroom doorway from the onset of the project, then remediation works would have cost in the region of about $5,000 to $10,000 and would have taken about 3 to 4 weeks to complete, with the occupants still living at home. However, due to the complexity of the multiple parties involved in the project, including lawyers on both sides, plus the additional cleaning work and accommodation costs, plus settlement fees, the project costs escalated northwards of $100,000. Plus the eventual settlement costs of the property at market value and the contents exceeded $700,000. So that's, that's a pretty big jump up from 5 to 10K to $800,000.
Oh yeah.
That's just because of the insurance contractor not putting containment up on that single doorway.
Mm. Yeah.
So that's the best example I've got of where contaminant has caused, obviously lack of contaminant has caused cross-contamination issues, which has obviously expedited the costs and also increased the costs, and also I think it was about 12 to 18 months this project went on for, as opposed to 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah. Well, I might wrap it up there and hopefully leave a bit of time for questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully now we've got an opportunity now. If there's any bits that people want to ask more about, or particular concepts or that kind of thing, would be great to have some questions.
Mike, I do have a couple of questions here in the chat. If you want to run through them.
Sure.
I think Cedric's answered a couple in the chat, but I'll read them out just in case, so you can
sure.
talk to it. Tabitha asks that, so in the example there where the mould was growing in the roof at the school, what are the health ramifications for staff working in that space if there's no remediation?
Yeah, that is an interesting one. Cedric's 100% right there on the exposure pathways. Sometimes things, depending on the construction of the building, it can be really well contained within the actual building envelope. That doesn't mean it won't get out or it can't get out. It just means their exposure is likely minimal. It might be dependent upon lots of different stuff. But of course, the difficulty with those things is they do produce odors, they do off gas, but also if that's not fixed, if no one takes record of that in future, if remedial works, or if even just building works go on, let's say someone wants to put in a new power point, and they cut a hole in the wall and they don't realize the other side is completely moldy, you've made an enormous problem because you've spread spores everywhere. So the health effects can be very variable, but leaving something in place where there's a potential problem can be a much bigger problem in the future.
We also have a question from Luke. He says, from a property management perspective, is there any mould that is less problematic and toxic that generally does not require major remediation, i.e. pink mould versus black mould?
Yeah, I agree with Cedric's response there as well. If there is mold, it's a problem, and it's generally always a moisture problem. There are some things that do turn up before others or after others or based upon the nature of the material, but totally agree, irrespective of the mold type, it does point to an issue and an issue that needs to be solved. I don't think I would ever be comfortable saying, oh, that's mold's fine to leave there. Don't worry, even though the whole wall is moldy, it's not the bad kind. I don't think I would ever say those words. You really always do have to remediate stuff. If you can see visible mold, you know you've got a problem.
And this is a secondary question from Luke. Is there a product generally used to treat surface mold, i.e. when bathrooms, exhaust fans and windows don't adequately ventilate the bathroom?
I've talked all over the last couple of questions. I'm happy to do this one as well, or if someone else wants to jump in. What works to clean a moldy bathroom, guys?
Well, I'll jump in with coming from an IEP perspective and a safety perspective is, if we follow the hierarchy of control in terms of getting rid of reducing a hazard and a risk, elimination. So we can eliminate the causes and the reasons for why mold is growing. That should be our #1 priority. And even the World Health Organization guidelines say, you know, the actions to remediate and to control water moisture from coming into the situation in the first place should have priority. Unfortunately, in this particular situations, which we all come across many times, ventilation inadequate, or they do not switch on the exhaust fans, resulting in moist air in that environment. Okay, for mold to grow, you need moisture, you need some sort of an organic matter, and that could be dust. So this, or it could be skin flakes, it could be the soap scum that comes off when you're in that bathroom environment. So moisture, food source, and over time mold will grow. So if we, again, eliminate, if we can, through exhaust and through proper cleaning of your bathroom or whatever surface that you have, that should take priority rather than waiting for the mold to come and then, oh my, what do we need to do? Here, let's get some spray and wipe and magically it disappears. Again, many of those chemicals and products are chlorine based, which is, again, we talked about all the different ways of getting rid of mold by making them invisible. But really, if we can focus on behaviors of switching on exhaust fans before and after you've had that bath, getting rid from a housekeeping perspective of potential organic matter food source, and quick action when you see any leaks, you know, simply getting onto them in terms of drying it up immediately. And from a tenant property management perspective, you have to have that relationship with your tenants such that they report to you. You then make sure that you action it as quick as soon as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one of a quick final point I'll make is I see a lot of people say, I use essential oils, or I use bleach, or I use vinegar, or I use different things. And often continually wiping over a surface, particularly a painted surface or a finished surface, a sealed surface with a solvent or a chemical agent, will slowly break that surface down and make it more porous and then more likely to have mold growth. So if you have a painted wall and then you keep rubbing essential oils and other stuff, you probably end up taking off whatever protective coating is there and making it more likely to have mold growth. So it can be counterproductive in the long run to just wipe and wipe and wipe and wipe and wipe. I can see we've got one more question there. What happens if you don't have an exhaust fan in your bathroom? That's a complicated question. That depends what your ventilation is like, whether you attempt to open windows, if there's other ventilation you can have in your house, if there's other extraction fans. Dehumidifiers do exist. You can put them in place, although they're obviously not as effective as actually getting that air out. You could have colder showers if you really wanted, but that depends on your constitution, really. That's going to be a bit of an uphill battle. My advice is try to install an exhaust fan, because otherwise you're really fighting uphill to try to capture that moisture in a dehumidifier or something like that. If you were going to go that route, I would suggest you go for an actual dehumidifier and not just moisture absorbing powders or those things that really don't work that well.
And make sure it's plumbed.
Yes, make sure it's plumbed. I can see we're running out of time. We've got 2 more questions. Recommendation on a household HEPA filter, and what is the cost range to remediate a moldy problem that is isolated to a particular wall in an office? In terms of a household HEPA filter, I don't have a specific one on the top of my head. Generally, you will see a better one will have, it'll conform to a particular series of standards. It'll say conforms to standard ISO, and then a series of what it actually conforms to. Look for those. Cheap online things that don't meet certain, they might meet minimum standards for electrical safety, but they don't meet the rating of a HEPA filter. Look those up and check to see if it does. So I don't have one off the top of my head, but as a general bit of advice, look what standards they conform to. Second one, how much does it cost to remediate? Does anyone else want to jump in on that one? It's a very open-ended question. It's a huge question, but does someone want to give the 60-second potted summary for how much does mold remediation cost?
It depends on the size, how big it is. Are we removing gyprock? Are we removing asbestos-containing materials?
Is there carpet?
Yep. So it can range from a couple $100s to a couple $1,000, depending on the amount of contaminated material that needs to be removed, and where the containment it's going to be in place, and whether that wall connects to another. So like I said, a couple $100s to a couple $1,000 depends. Yeah,
very much so. If you have to move out of your tenancy into another, you've got relocation costs. It can be quite multivariate. Unfortunately, it's not a flat answer on that one. Right.
Cool. I think that's all the questions, and yeah, just on time, or a couple minutes over. I'd just like to say, from a Marsh perspective, thank you to Michael, Cedric, and Ian for their time today. You know, it's very, very informative, and I'm sure hopefully we'll get another see you guys again down the track for another Marsh webinar.
Absolutely.
And thank you also to everyone that attended. Keep an eye out in your email for the recording, as well as the slides and more information to contact the guys. But yeah, is there anything you wanted to say, Michael, before we send everyone off?
No, thanks for having us. Reach out to Greencap if you need some help. You don't know which way to go. You are at any stage of a project, please do give us a call. You can talk to us, and we'll at least try to set you on the right path if we're directly involved or not.
Yep, and I would just like to add that in the coming weeks, we are also developing a mold hazard awareness online course. So keep your eyes out for Greencap, and we're going to be releasing that very, very soon.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good day. See ya.
Bye.